So hi everyone, good morning again or afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from around the world. I just want to say this workshop was initially designed for a UK audience, but we have since had a lot of interest from across the world. So thank you all. This is really an honour to be presenting and discussing this topic with you all today. My name is Steve Baker from Animix International, and I'm joined behind the scenes by my colleagues Lily and Ellie, who are going to be keeping an eye on questions and comments, as well as making sure that I don't break anything along the way. I'm also joined by Ed Parr-Ferris from Devon Wildlife Trust and Ben Hewlett from National Highways, who I will give proper introductions to later. But gentlemen, can I just ask you to put on your audio and we'll just check your microphones are working?
Yeah, hello.
Perfect. I can see you there, Ed, as well. And you there, Ben. Wonderful. So just some housekeeping items to get started. Those of you who aren't familiar with Zoom, you should automatically be able to see the slides with a picture of a hedgehog and the title and some information about the presentation. If you wish to adjust this to see more of the presenters, then you can do so in the settings. If you wish to share any questions or comments in the chat, please do so. And if you do wish to raise your hand to make a contribution or comment at any point, then also please do this. This presentation is being recorded and it will be circulated afterwards. So if you do have to dip out for any reason, don't worry, you will be able to catch up and share this with any other members of your network who are unable to join us today. And this would not be possible without the funding and support of National Highways and the Devon Wildlife Trust. So we are truly grateful again for the opportunity to have worked with them on this project. Now, this event is free, but we do encourage those who can make a donation to the Wildlife Trust to support their conservation work and effort to do so. You can scan the QR code on the screen using a mobile device, but there is also a link in the chat to a donation page, and this can also be found on the events website page where you signed up to this workshop. Now, this is an interactive session, and the more you put in, the more you will get out of it. So please don't be shy. Every contribution, no matter how big or small, is great because we can't learn if we don't share and speak up. So please get involved when the opportunities arise. And the more you contribute and engage, the better. It also means the less you'll have to listen to me, which really can't be a bad thing. If you have a comment or contribution to make at any time, as I said during the session, please feel free to submit it in the chat box within Zoom. And again, this can be found on the toolbar at the bottom of your window. And again, also raise your hand if you wish to make a contribution, and we'll let you join in verbally or via video if you wish. You should also have received an email to various Slido links, which we're going to be using throughout the session. If you're not familiar with Slido, it's a great interactive tool that will enable us to interact with each other and also share our thoughts and ideas. You'll be prompted when the time comes to gain access. You can scan the codes on the screen, again using your mobile device or by visiting the links on the screen as well as the chat. We will stop for questions and contributions as we go through, but we also have a dedicated discussion session at the end. So if we're unable to cover things as we go, we can all engage and reflect on this towards the end. If we do run out of time to address any conversations and questions, we will collate these and circulate responses to everyone via email afterwards. So what are we going to look at today? Now, today's focus is all about exploring how we can use existing infrastructure to help wildlife connectivity and look at reasonably low cost and simple interventions that we could apply to help this. Now, in brief, we will explore how roads and other linear infrastructure will impact wildlife. We will look at where we should consider putting enhancements or interventions to aid wildlife connectivity, and this will explore various methodologies to help this. We will then explore what potential enhancements are and what might be appropriate for different situations. And then we will then discuss how we actually get these connectivity enhancements or interventions implemented, discussing collaborations and the need to be persistent and patient. We'll then share some existing real-world examples of different interventions and share insights into how these have been identified as options and then illustrated as part of our Network for Nature funded project called Creating Species Highways within the county of Devon in the UK. Now, just to kick things off, I want to ask you all to share what you may already know to be good interventions or things to consider that we could help to improve wildlife connectivity when it comes to roads or any linear infrastructure, really. So if you can scan the QR code on the screen with your mobile device, or alternatively, you can visit slido.com and enter the number there, 5843040, when prompted. And I'll give you all a few minutes just to make a contribution, and then we'll all be able to see what people share as a word cloud will generate in front of us on the screen. Now, there are going to be a lot of people on this call that are incredibly experienced within this field and have contributed to the identification, installation, and monitoring of various interventions. And to those people, I encourage you to contribute as much as you can, again, to this entire workshop, as you have a lot of knowledge that many others will benefit from. Now, there will also be people with us today who this is a completely new concept for. So I call on these people to ask lots of questions and engage, because you really have the opportunity to learn a lot during this session. Now, not to put words into your mouth or things on the screen already, but an obvious thing is green bridges, underpasses, or wildlife crossing structures as an intervention, which is obviously all fantastic, but try and have a little think about kind of smaller scale interventions or concepts that you think could help. No matter how big or small or radical they may seem, please share them. Obviously, sharing your current knowledge will help us to just get an idea of people's existing understanding of where we're at today, and then also provide some jumping off points for the session as we go through. And as you continue to add to the slide, I just want to say we've had nearly 200 people sign up to this webinar, and we've got approximately 90 people on live right now. So it really does show there's a kind of real interest and demand and a desire to kind of help improve wildlife connectivity across the world, which is really, really encouraging to see, and obviously puts absolutely no pressure on me to make sure this isn't a complete disaster. So thanks again, everyone. So lots of contributions coming in there. And the larger ones you will kind of see is typically things that people have said multiple times. But and again, looking at the list of people attending today, there's a lot of biologists, there's a lot of engineers, planners, funders, and government agencies. So a whole variety of professions who all play vital roles in helping to identify, develop, and implement these wildlife connectivity measures. So again, lots and lots of knowledge and diversity and kind of reasons for being here today, every one of which kind of plays obviously a vital role in contributing to making these types of projects happen. So yeah, lots of things there. Throughout the session, if you want to keep adding to this, then obviously please do. But I realise I've kind of done a lot of talking already without really introducing who I am. So my name's Steve Baker, and I'm the Technical Director of Animex International. As a brief introduction, Animex International is a wildlife connectivity focused company, and we kind of pride ourselves on being able to identify, understand, design, and implement solutions to ensure that habitats remain connected as us and our infrastructure networks grow. Animex was founded around 11 years ago, originally as a wildlife fencing company, and since then we've expanded to provide and support solutions of all different types all over the world for NGOs, government departments, and well, many others, to help solve problems and ensure connectivity for wildlife and their habitats remain. You can see from this kind of gallery of images, we do a variety of different things, and again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here exploring this topic with you all today. Now, as I mentioned, this workshop has been developed as part of the advocacy work we've been doing with Devon Wildlife Trust and National Highways for a Network for Nature funded project. Devon Wildlife Trust contracted us to help deliver a project called Creating Species Highways under the Network for Nature banner. And this investigated possible locations and ways that we could implement ecological enhancements on existing infrastructure on two main roads within the county of Devon in the south within the UK. Now, the outcomes from this project was not to illustrate what will be done, as budgets and plans for implementing enhancements on National Highways assets has not yet been identified, but it was really to look at what could be done and use the project as an opportunity to educate and influence any future decisions. And one of the outcomes was a shortlisted selection of enhancements for the target list of species we looked at as part of the project, and then some areas within the project that could also be worth exploring in more detail in the future. Now, we're lucky to have Ed Parferris from Devon Wildlife Trust with us today, who was the brains behind coming up with this project and also acquiring the funding to deliver it. And again, it's been a pleasure to get to know and work with Ed on this project, and it's my pleasure even more so to kind of introduce him today. I'll hand over to Ed to give a little bit more of an insight into the project and the work both him and the team at Devon Wildlife Trust do. So, Ed, is it okay to hand over?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Lovely to see you all. So my name's Ed Parferris. I'm Conservation Manager at Devon Wildlife Trust. My background's in conservation land management and landscape scale nature recovery. Devon Wildlife Trust is a wildlife NGO and charity in the county of Devon in southwest England. Got about 120 staff, 35,000 members, and we come out of the sort of traditional place of wildlife charities, of getting nature reserves, having volunteers and the likes, and that's that sort of traditional approach to conservation in the UK of holding the line. But over the last 25 years, we've increasingly looked to landscape scale conservation, recognising that nature is still in decline and that we need to work across whole landscapes rather than just in small isolated reserves across the landscape. So when we're looking at landscape scale conservation, that might include things like species reintroductions for things like pine marten or Eurasian beaver. It might include species recovery for species like great horseshoe bat, freshwater pearl mussel or marsh fritillary or something of that sort. Then the sort of bread and butter work is the habitat and ecosystem recovery. So the habitats on the ground, whether that's temperate rainforest, calm grassland, which is a type of wet grassland in Devon, and wetland mosaics. And that really relies on building networks of habitats across multiple landowners. It's normally private land ownership in our county, and so working with those private landowners and using government grant schemes to make that happen. The pictures here on the left are our nature reserves, and then some species of pine marten and beaver there, and a couple of our landscape projects on East Dartmoor and then in the Avon Valley in South Devon, which is about rebuilding habitats. Steve, do you want to bump me along?
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, I'll drive the slides for you.
Yeah, we'll do that wonderful thing.
There we go.
So when we look at species for nature recovery projects, we're really looking at species as a sort of flagship for a particular habitat or ecosystem. So great horseshoe bat or pine marten or hazel dormouse would be key species components of woodlands. Barn owls and harvest mice might represent species-rich grasslands. Narrow-headed ant or nightjar might be flagships for heathlands. And while we might focus on one or two species for projects like this, we'd always look at a much larger suite. They're just representing that much larger suite across a large landscape. And we've become very aware of the risks in those landscapes. But we do tend to focus a lot of, as a wildlife charity, on we focus a lot of our time on looking at the land management risks and opportunities. But clearly the urban and linear infrastructure is becoming increasingly important in that. Next one, Steve, thank you. So roads represent a key risk to species and a barrier to movement. The strategic road network in England, so the map on the right, I think, is the right image of the strategic road network. Brilliant, thanks, Ben. And you can see, so we're the sort of, I don't know if my cursor will show, but the bulge in the peninsula on the bottom left of the map is Devon, and you can see that it's bisected by particularly two key roads in the county. And that separates components of species populations and isolates parts of populations and can restrict repopulation when there are things like localized stochastic losses, so when you might get a disease risk or a weather event which wipes out local populations. So you can see that having a county bisected is not a great situation. The image in the top left there is of the Holden Ridge. This is a SSSI, that's our nationally important designation, and it's designated for its heathland, its birds and its butterflies. But it's got two dual carriageways running right through the middle of it. And And it's also an area that repeatedly gets road traffic accidents from deer collisions. There's been talk of a green bridge at Holden for decades, but of course it's expensive and therefore it keeps getting shelved. So what we don't want to do is just say, that was a great idea, it's not going to happen, let's just abandon everything. Instead, we want to look at, well, okay, could we do something for species here? But when we do see species crossings being put in, they're often in response to a specific issue at a single site for a single species. So the example in the bottom middle image there is of a bat bridge. And we see these being put in, and they're expensive. And while they might help a specific species, they don't help the wider suite of species. And I think that's not then really addressing that nature recovery issue more widely. Next slide, please, Steve. Don't know if Steve's still there to move it on. There he is. Excellent. Right, so with this project, what we started looking at was habitat suitability across Devon for multiple species. We looked at about 15 species across the county. They were chosen to represent different groups of species. But very quickly, when you start looking at habitat suitability, you see that it's possible, likely, or common. There are three of the colours that you can see here for species to be present across large areas of the county, meaning they come into contact with the road network sort of as a regular course of activity. So species that are specialists for different habitats might have different focal areas, but when you add them all up, at any point over the whole network, you're likely to be coming into contact with species that are crossing those features. But the advantage of doing this sort of mapping is that we can understand where there might be key pinch points for multiple species. We can also see which species might be generic risks across the network, and also where there are specific groups of species with a particular set of requirements. Maybe there are woodland species or there are water environment species, and where they come into contact with the road. What this also shows is the need for a sort of proactive, strategic approach to species crossings across the county. You clearly can't address all these species coming into contact with the strategic road network with just one or two interventions for a specific species. This requires multiple interventions. So trying to embed that approach into how we manage our roads is going to be really important going forwards. Next slide. So I'm just going to cover a couple of examples of based on projects that I've been involved in. So this example is around greater horseshoe bat, which is a species that Devon is a stronghold for in Northern Europe. We ran a project for a number of years, and this is based on some PhD's research, and this is modelling using circuitscape mapping to predict where bats will move through the landscape. So where you can see the red or yellows in this, that's potential current across the landscape, and therefore where bats are likely to be moving across the landscape. The black lines represent key flyways, but actually the main one that goes sort of from the top to the bottom on that image on the right there is also the A38 corridor. The other one's the River Dart going across there. And it shows that great horseshoe bats move out of this roost, which is the central green dot there, and we'll move across that landscape, and we'll cross the A38 at multiple points across that network. They're not just using one or two places, they're crossing it absolutely everywhere. Anywhere there's a hedge network or a stream, whatever, they'll be moving across. But also, the tiny little image in the bottom left there is based on some radio tracking work that was done a number of years ago, which is the same area. And we can see that radio tracked bats cross the network, but also use the road network as a corridor in its own right. And so it makes it more complicated. We've got bats using the road network as a corridor and crossing it, which obviously puts them at risk. The top left image is of streetlights crossing that network that they're using, and you can see that they form a barrier to the connectivity of the red lines that are going through there. So we know that streetlights are both a barrier within the landscape, which could be negative, obviously, but also could be a tool that you could use to restrict movement if you've got a sensitive area. Now, as with most species, great horseshoe bats it's all about conservation of energy, and it's critical for both individual survival but also breeding success. So if an individual animal has to make a longer journey to get from A to B to get to a crossing point a little way away, it's using more energy, and that means its body is going to be less in worse condition, which is going to make breeding less likely to be successful, and that's going to have a population level impact. So that's why we're interested in this sort of stuff, is to try and understand how can we make this work better. Couple more slides. Next slide, please, Steve. Next example is pine martens. Now, we've been busy reintroducing pine martens over the last few years, but last year we did a reintroduction, and this image shows the dispersal and activity following about 4 months following release, based on radio tracking data. And we've seen that pine martens have moved across this area. Now, this covers the two main roads, the A30 and the A38, but also the A380, which is another main dual carriageway. And these pine martens have clearly been crisscrossing across these. We don't actually know exactly where they're crossing and whether they're going using bridges, underpasses, or across the carriageway. And that is concerning because at the same period of time, we've noticed about 3 or 4 polecat roadkill. That's another mustelid species of similar size to a pine marten in these same areas. So we know that this road network is a really clear and present risk, both to polecats, but also to pine martens. Next one, and I don't know if you might have to press the video to go, Steve. So this captures GPS data from 2 pine martens that as they move away from release. So we've got a green dot and a sort of yellowish dot. You can see they're very mobile. This area is probably covering about, I'm just going to think, probably about 25 kilometers across the whole screen. And the yellow animal did about 150 kilometers in this period of movement. And they crisscross the road network multiple times, both in terms of the major road network and minor road network. Now, this obviously is just 2 animals that we've been able to radio track because we've reintroduced them. But clearly, there's many, many more animals out there that are crisscrossing the network. If where we see this, we know that other mustelids, whether it's badgers or otters or polecats, but also other species, foxes, birds of prey, etc., are going to be moving across these landscapes in exactly the same way. We know the risk then is in terms of barrier effect, but also direct mortality, that isolation and repopulation effect. It's a real impact for multiple animal species. It applies to all species, and so this strategic approach is really important moving forwards. Right, I'm going to leave it there. You can turn that off, Steve. Thank you. I hope that gives a reasonable introduction as to why we're hoping to carry out this project.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's really, really insightful and really, really interesting. I really appreciate you taking the time to share that. As I mentioned, this project was funded by National Highways and was one of many projects that actually fell under the Network for Nature programme. And we are lucky to have with us today Ben Hewlett, who is the Senior Environmental Advisor from National Highways. Ben, do you mind telling us a little bit more about all the great work that you folks do?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, as Steve said, my name is Ben Hewlett. I'm Senior Advisor at National Highways, but focusing on biodiversity and the soft state, which is our sort of vegetated land ownership across the country. Responsible for a number of design standards, including an emerging one on wildlife connectivity structures, which would be the UK's first, which would be good. And yeah, a lot of time spent thinking strategically about how we solve various environmental problems on the network. Next slide, please. Always makes me feel like Chris Whitty. Next one is, who are we? So National Highways, as Ed said, we are the operators, maintainers, and improvers of what we call the strategic road network, which is basically all the motorways and all the major trunk roads in England. About 4,500 miles of network, but it's massively important for making the country work. So it's about 2.5% of the road network in the UK, but it carries 2/3 of the freight. And in terms of sort of wildlife connectivity structures and thinking about this issue strategically, we are far behind the rest of Europe, the US and Canada as well. We have 2 large strategic crossings on the network at the moment, one on the A21 down in Kent and on the A556 just north of Manchester. but we've got another 3 in construction, one on the M25 junction 10, one on the A30 down in Cornwall, and one on the A417 in Gloucestershire. So yeah, far behind what we should be doing. And yeah, aware that this is a strategic problem that needs a strategic solution. And the ones that we are building at the moment are solely linked with big infrastructure project improvements rather than isolated projects to address a specific environmental problem. So next, please. So yeah, here's a few examples of sort of intentional habitat connectivity structures that we've got on the network. So we've got a couple of large mammal tunnels, and those are the 2 green bridges that I mentioned that are already in construction. And Ed had a picture of that one in the middle on the A556 in his presentation. And we know that these work. We've got data from passage across all of them. They're not all of them in line with what would be standard these days if you look at international research, but they are working and they are providing an ecosystem benefit. Next slide, please. We also have examples of unintentional habitat connectivity structures on the network as well. So top left is a fairly ratty looking culvert that goes under the M25, but that facilitates about 100 deer movements twice a day, we found. Top right is deer crossing the M25 again on a green structure, not a green bridge. Some soil has fallen off tractors over the years and it's vegetated, and things are using that. And then bottom right, we have the famous ponies of the New Forest using pedestrian access tunnels as well, to acting as a connection between that as well. So there is more permeability than I think we are aware of, and we are beginning to figure out how species are moving through the landscape and using existing structures. And then one last slide from me. And I said we need to be strategically thinking about this because it's a strategic problem nationwide. So in order to address biodiversity declines that are happening at the moment, UK policy is very much focused on building new areas of habitat through things like biodiversity net gain. But a lot of the time those are isolated pockets and they're not connected to other things. So connectivity is sort of a thing that's been missed in the UK policy on this at the moment. So one thing that National Highways are beginning to promote is this idea of a national strategic nature network. So similar to our national strategic highway network, could we do something similar for nature? So we've been promoting that with our regulators and seeing whether we can get that going. One thing that we did found was the SRN, so the Strategic Road Network, has sort of been seen as this impassable barrier in local nature recovery strategies and national recovery networks, just a sort of this unsolvable issue. And we've seen it sort of artificially limiting ambition of those strategies. So we're keen to engage with them and actually say that we are interested in working with this and beginning to explore these issues and how much additional benefit could be added if the SRN was a bit more permeable. And National Highways would like to be part of the solution, and how we do that is sort of an emerging concept. So it's an exciting time in the connectivity space. So yeah, well, I'm sure we'll get into the weeds about it, Steve. But that's all for me for the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And again, yeah, really, really insightful, especially the kind of like unintentional permeability examples actually showing that without any intervention, the network maybe not be as impermeable as people first perceive. And yeah, really, really interesting. And yeah, you touched on it being a really exciting time within the UK for connectivity. And it really is. There's lots of initiatives, interest and investment kind of being made in connectivity. And I also want to take this opportunity to say that it's just been announced that the UK will host the 2026 INE conference. Now, for those of you that don't know about INE, which stands for the Infrastructure and Ecology Network Europe, they are an incredible organisation that was initiated in 1996, and it's a network of experts working with various aspects of transportation, infrastructure and ecology, and they provide an independent, international and interdisciplinary arena for the exchange and the development of expert knowledge, and that's all within the aim to promote a safe and ecologically sustainable pan-European transport infrastructure. And although INE is branded as a European group, it truly is one of the most kind of diverse and dynamic organisations dedicated to wildlife and connectivity, and also linear infrastructure that I personally have kind of ever encountered during my career. So I highly recommend keeping your eyes peeled for further announcements, and urge you to make the trip to the UK at the end of the summer in 2026 if you can. Now, just moving on, quickly just want to highlight how roads impact wildlife. Now, Ben and Ed touched on this, and many of you may know this already, but there are many of you on here that may not, and it will provide kind of some context to the enhancements, interventions and conversations we are going to explore. So just to list a few of these known impacts, we have habitat fragmentation. Now, roads divide habitats into smaller isolated patches, making it difficult for wildlife to move freely between areas. We have wildlife mortality or roadkill. Collisions with vehicles are a direct cause of wildlife mortality for some species. Barriers to movement. For many species, roads act as physical barriers, and this is especially problematic for animals that rely on large territories, seasonal migrations or dispersal for reproduction, like large mammals, reptiles and amphibians. We have habitat loss and degradation. The construction of roads can lead to the permanent loss of habitats through the clearing of vegetation, the alteration of water drainage patterns, and also soil compaction. We have pollution. Roads contribute to various forms of pollution, such as noise, light, and chemical. Altered behavior and stress on animals. Proximity to roads can alter the behavior of wildlife, forcing animals to change their movement patterns, feeding habits, or reproductive strategies. And then also invasive species. Now, roads can facilitate the spread of invasive species by providing corridors for their movement, or by creating kind of disturbed habitats where invasive plants can outcompete native ones. Now, it's not all bad news, because roads do also provide, as Ben and Ed mentioned, fantastic parallel connectivity and enable wildlife to move through the landscape, particularly utilising kind of roadside verges. It can just be a bit of a challenge at times for them to cross from one side to the other. But again, there are so many existing bridges, underpasses and interventions that we can use and consider to help bridge this gap. And that is what we are going to look at today. Now, again, I just mentioned the UK will be hosting the INE conference in 2026, but as part of the great work that INE do, they have produced what is known as the Biodiversity and Infrastructure Handbook for Action. Now, the handbook includes comprehensive, scientifically backed information and guidance that's compiled by some of the leading names within the industry, and it's all available for free. It's being curated to help everybody understand and implement the best practices for wildlife when kind of building or adapting existing infrastructure for transport. Now, we have had the pleasure at Animex of contributing some information to this handbook, and we also use this tool significantly as part of this Network for Nature project. So I do urge you all to make a note of this, particularly the website down the bottom, and take a look at this digital handbook after this workshop. But I want to get into this in more detail now. So to start with, I want to explore where we consider putting interventions, and you should have all been sent this link already. And I want to look at how we can identify connectivity opportunities on our network. Now, again, a lot of talking from me, so I want to get some input and thought from all of you, and share how you've perhaps previously identified areas where enhancements or interventions should or could be used. And obviously, those of you who don't have any experience in this, please share thoughts on perhaps what methodology you think could be used. So again, scan the QR code on the screen using a mobile device, and then you also enter the number if you visit slido.com. I'm just going to change to this screen, and hopefully you can see this. And we can see it start to populate as you go. I can see collaboration on there. That's a great one. And kind of while you're doing that, I'll just briefly explain what methodology we actually used within our project, and then we can look at and discuss everyone's contributions. So we were given a list of target species we had to consider connectivity for, or connectivity opportunities for, and this was provided by Devon Wildlife Trust, and Ed touched on some of those species earlier. We then used species distribution and habitat suitability data to identify what areas along the roads may seem most appropriate. We then assessed known structures, such as bridges and underpasses, within these particular areas, and then we rated those on their potential to be enhanced for connectivity and created a shortlist from that. Now, this was by no means the best, in inverted commas, approach we could have taken, but it was the most informed approach we could have taken within the limitations of the project, and it did provide us with a reasonable and validated outcome that we could use to make informed decisions and conclusions from. In contrast, some projects I've worked in Canada, particularly for reptiles and amphibians, for example, only use roadkill data to highlight a need for intervention. Now, this is often enough to initiate the implementation of perhaps fencing, and kind of adapting existing underpasses or installing new wildlife crossing structures. And this is especially when it's linked to protected or endangered species. Wider connectivity may or may not be considered because there's often an immediate risk to populations that need addressing quickly. In other projects, the immediate risk may not be so apparent, or there may not be funding or legislation in place to protect certain species. These projects may look at a kind of more long-term, kind of projective modelling data set, and this is commonly used when perhaps looking at species reintroductions, for example, and it's something I'm aware of is currently being used for pine martens in Kent, which is a county kind of on the opposite side of the country from where Devon is, and they're kind of exploring much more than just roads, and looks at other factors such as wider land use considerations, natural habitat corridors through the landscape, and then obviously all associated adjustments that may or may not need to be made to perhaps sustain a population over 100 years or so across a really, really broad landscape. So in essence, there's lots and lots of amazing ideas and things contributed to this, but when kind of focused on data from any source that you may be obtaining that, whether that through spatial analysis, to talking to members of the public or landowners, actually being able to track animals, wildlife vehicle collision studies, all of this stuff is essentially, you can never have too much data and information to get, and you want to get the most out of what you have available and within your budget and the constraints of your project, and that's kind of all really you can do. Excuse me. And just to kind of provide some points on that, again, data is key. Use what's available and use what's relevant. Is there anybody who wants to kind of contribute or elaborate or share more on what they may have said or shared within the Slido if I hop back to that? Please don't be shy, but I understand if you may not want to. Or we can all kind of see from there. On to the next. So effectively, we've kind of looked at, understanding potentially where we may look or want or need to look at connectivity intervention, and then it's kind of looking at what are you going to do. Now, it may be that you don't have to do anything, as Ben kind of kindly shared and we touched on earlier, because the road you're focusing on may not be considered a barrier for some species, but also that same road might have a huge impact or be a problem for other species. So just to take badgers for a kind of random example, European badgers could easily traverse a kind of minor road, and perhaps due to low traffic volumes or the road's widths, it's not considered a problem or a barrier. But again, if there perhaps is no canopy connectivity over the top, linking vegetation over the road, that same road could be a large barrier for other species such as small birds, invertebrates, or arboreal species such as hazel dormice. So understanding again the aims of your project and what interventions or enhancements may be appropriate is important. So something, or sometimes nothing may be the approach, while others on the other hand may need an awful lot of intervention. So not everything again will work for every opportunity, but having a really broad understanding of what should be considered is really, really useful. And something that is important to consider is that many interventions or mitigation projects often do target often kind of particular species. So using any opportunity you have to implement some kind of some enhancement or intervention, if you can use that as an opportunity to help multiple species at the same time, then that would be great. You know, it's really beneficial and something that I think and urge you all to do. I know particularly in North America, and rightly so, you know, large mammals, because of the risk and the safety risk to drivers, is a big thing that drives mitigation and large bridges. But obviously using that as an opportunity to kind of safeguard, protect the public from smaller species and also protect those species themselves, you know, kind of getting more bang for your buck in that way. And again, the ONE handbook is an amazing tool to kind of help understand what may be best for your project, as well as kind of other guidelines from your local transport department or country, if they are available. So some of the most apparent interventions that are often used and considered, and again, many of you may have seen some of these before, are kind of as follows on this list. Now, this isn't a comprehensive list of everything possible, but at the top of the list, I've kind of put shiny new green bridges and underpasses. Again, is a kind of obvious and a well-known intervention that has been seen to be successful for various species all across the world. But we're really looking again at typically lower cost, smaller scale, and perhaps retrofitted enhancements. Now these include, but again are not limited to, the following. And if there's anything else people would like to share, again, please throw it in the chat or the conversations. I will just say in the chat, make sure that you kind of select everyone rather than kind of hosts and panelists, just so everybody on the call can see what people are sharing, should you wish for them to see it. So just to go through the list, we have traffic calming, perhaps speed enforcement or road closures. Again, these kind of have varying degrees of effectiveness. Some are also harder to enforce than others. Fencing is a really popular and common proven kind of effective measure, but it is expensive and it should also be used in combination with connectivity features or crossings. Otherwise, you're potentially hindering connectivity and movement through the landscape. We have shelves and ledges, excuse me, again, effective, but perhaps only appropriate for a particular or a small range of species. We have roadside verge maintenance. This can help connectivity along roadsides and perhaps guide animals towards crossing opportunities, but also, more importantly, increase biodiversity along the networks. We have wildlife detection, a common consideration for large mammals, but the limited data on its effectiveness has contributed to a kind of apprehension for implementation in some cases. We have furniture, kind of adding components such as logs, rocks, and other things. It may encourage animals to traverse an overpass or underpass and could be useful. And then some other big ones often focused on kind of lighting. Adjusting artificial lighting on or near roads and structures might have an impact on the use by animals. And then again, noise reduction. Controlling noise may also have an impact on how animals interact with existing structures. Does anybody else have anything else to add to the list?
Steve, can I just mention that one thing we have explored is using the surrounding vegetation to send birds and bats up higher over the carriageway, so it reduces their mortality risk from, you know, strike risk. You can also use the vegetation around to guide them, as you say, to other features, whether that's features on the same side of the road as them, or to take them to a safe crossing point. They're not always effective, but they might have a population level effect, which is valuable.
Yeah, that's great. And that kind of echoes what Paul's just put in the chat there, and vegetation improvements. So using vegetation and the natural habitats and landscape and resource you have available in various ways, whether that's to change behavior, or also to perhaps increase biodiversity in a particular area.
It's also relatively cost effective, and of course has all those other benefits as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, and again, after a kind of few more slides, we'll take a short break, and then after that, I am going to go on and share some interesting case studies with kind of some hand-picked intervention examples from this list, and illustrate and demonstrate how they have been done in reality, and then also how we kind of have illustrated their potential use within the project in Devon. So, really, the third and final stage of things to consider is how. So to get to this stage, we've hopefully identified where may be best to put an intervention, and then we've explored what intervention or interventions we may like to implement in an area, and now we need to work out how these interventions are going to be implemented. And in my experience, this can be the most challenging part of any project. Now, in a perfect scenario, you've already been engaging with every single stakeholder, every single department, and you already have everybody's support, and then hopefully a lot of funding to deliver it. But obviously we don't live in a perfect world, but what we can do is our very best to try and make it as perfect as possible. And I can't stress enough, and someone shared this within the word cloud at the start, kind of how important collaboration and communication is in helping to initiate and execute any project. Now, to provide some context, there again, as I mentioned earlier, there are many people attending this event today that all have a kind of wide range of professional roles, and each one of those plays such a vital part in delivering a project. And no one of them can deliver a project without the others. So just to pick on a few professions, and these ones always kind of get picked on because they're kind of two of the key players, but is engineers and biologists. Engineers need biologists, and biologists need engineers in order to pull any project like this off. Now, in my kind of day-to-day, I often help to kind of sit in between and fill that void between the two, and kind of act as a mediator to kind of help make sure both sides are on the same page, maybe understand what is, what can, what should or what should not be done for a kind of range of species and a range of different scenarios. But projects can often be derailed because these two sides are not collaborating. Now, for example, a biologist may not have the support of an engineer because the intervention or enhancement being proposed is not possible from an engineering or a legal perspective. And then vice versa. I've seen many enhancements installed by engineers that they've been designed or installed perhaps incorrectly, because they either didn't listen to or have access to or input from a biologist. So, ideas on both sides with the best intentions moving forward, but because there wasn't a dialogue between the two, perhaps the best outcome wasn't achieved initially. Now, I've also lost count of how many fences I've seen installed that were designed to kind of guide animals to crossing structures that are actually just not connected, right at the point where an animal is meant to be able to use the crossing to get over, and instead they go all the way along the fence, find a little gap, make their way onto the road or rail right above or next to the structure specifically designed to help it cross safely. So realistically, what's most important is learning from each other and trying our best not to make the same mistakes, for want of a better phrase, that others had. And that's why sharing, opportunities like today and at conferences and everything else, the good and the bad, no matter the outcome, is all good information to share with each other. In some countries, kind of implementing features to aid wildlife connectivity is also old news, and everybody knows about that. But in some places, this is entirely new, and with that can come a reluctance or a hesitancy to deliver. But again, patience and persistence is key. Nothing happens overnight, and even projects that have no issues take time to deliver. So it's really, really worth just keeping on it, keep being optimistic, and keep doing what you're doing, because without it, nothing is going to improve. Ben, coming to you.
Yeah, just a couple of things to add on that. So I think when you look at where we are with this as a country, we are quite far behind. And I think it's an interesting question to say why. And ever since sort of learning more about the issue and getting involved over the last sort of few years, the why is because there isn't a government appraisal process to determine value for money for connectivity features. There is for creation of habitat, and lots of that happens, but the actual connectivity and to justify funds just isn't there yet, and it isn't standardized. So in terms of key challenges and sort of key focuses for the industry to push against, it's trying to define that, I think, is the first thing I'd say, just on the funding bit, because there is funding, but it's usually isolated and it's not strategic. And if we want to make a real difference to this, as Ed was saying, you're going to have lots of interventions everywhere, which is going to have a large price tag. So we need to be able to value that benefit, and that's something that we're pushing Natural England to explore and have a think about. And the other thing about the collaboration side of thing, and I think Ed's put something in the chat, but if say National Highways want to invest a couple of £100,000 into a intervention, we need certainty that the habitats either side are going to remain there, and they're going to be managed, and they're going to be looked after in perpetuity, because we're the bridge. But if the abutments on the side of the bridge fall over or disappear, that we've wasted our money and we haven't got any benefit. So this is why we've gone more strategic and I'm thinking around the sort of strategic nature network, because you can't do this in isolation. No one can. It's too difficult. So you have to have certainty that these landscapes are going to persist in the long term, and that the connections are going to be retained between these core areas of habitat that we
Yeah, it's a really interesting, really vital point there, and it kind of touches on what a couple of people are sharing in the chat, kind of seeing Wendy in there as well, just about the ongoing monitoring and maintenance. It's kind of getting the funding, money, support to deliver a thing, and then you walk away from it, and then is it looked after? What happens to the land use and other things over time, and how can it actually be kept up, sustained, monitored, and adjusted and things over the long term. And obviously initially finding the funding and the reasons why or how you could implement this. What policy is driving it? Is there any policy to do that? Where can the money streams and revenue come from? It's not easy. It's very, very complicated. But I think this kind of webinar today and the whole Network for Nature program in itself has been a real great opportunity for collaboration in various different shapes or forms throughout the kind of vast number of other Network for Nature funded projects and things like that. There is, from what I've seen, such a diverse range of things that have looked at wildlife and network, and I'm sure everybody can find out more about those projects on the Network for Nature website for highways, which I'll share on the email at the end of this. So I think before we're kind of at the hour mark now, pretty much bang on. So we're going to take a kind of 10-minute break, come back at about 10 minutes past, obviously. And then what we'll go on to is share some real world case studies of projects that demonstrate some interesting interventions, and also how we've illustrated that as part of some of the locations shortlisted with the Devon project. So yeah, I'll see you all in 10 minutes. Hi everyone, welcome back. I just had a request during the break to actually create a Slido just to see, show and share where everybody is from. So hopefully you can see that. So if you wouldn't mind and are happy and willing to do so, yeah, please join this new Slido, scan the code on the screen or visit slido.com. It'd just be really great to see kind of where people are joining from and perhaps what your job role is, what experience you have within this topic. I will also look to see how I can put this within the chat as we kind of move on. So we've got someone from Vermont as a biologist, California, 2 Americans, East and West Coast representing. Scotland, Indiana, engineers, Hertfordshire, Puerto Rico. There you go. I wasn't lying at the start when we said we had people from all over the place. Storyteller, I like that one.
Does California win for the earliest riser award? That sort of
I think it might do. Or unless, unless Australia is the kind of staying up late. Any other Australasians? I'm going to show some examples from Australia in a second. I know some of the people who shared that are most likely in bed right now.
I like the fact that we've got a hedgehog joining us. That's pretty good.
Yeah, and maybe the one from the Highways Conference. There was a couple of hedgehogs there, or humans disguised as 6-foot hedgehogs, which is both exciting and terrifying in equal measure. But yeah, that's great. Please keep contributing to that as we go. But as promised, I am going to kind of show you a range of examples where typically retrofitted enhancements or interventions have been used. That's not to say that any of these can't be used, when a new construction, new road or anything is being built, just say retrofitted, because typically they are added to other structures or other structures that are adapted. But yeah, these are examples of how some of these have been used on real life projects, again, from kind of all across the world. And then within each kind of enhancement or feature, I'll show how that intervention has been applied as part of our Network for Nature project in Devon. And again, just quickly, I want to say a big thank you to everyone who's shared information on their projects. People are referenced. If they're not, it's probably a photo that myself or one of my colleagues took. And to kind of kick things off, furniture here. This was from a conference in Australia, probably about 10 years ago now. That demonstrates potentially and personally one of the simplest and cheapest interventions that I think could be considered for enhancing potentially existing assets or added to new ones, and that's furniture. And this typically refers to the addition of logs, rocks, and kind of other objects, both natural and man-made, that can be added into or onto a structure to really just help encourage animals to cross. Now, in some instances, these kind of adaptations are fixed down, or others are kind of carefully placed within, around, or in structures. You can also place smaller tunnels or enclosed passageways within larger structures. That could also be considered furniture, and perhaps using kind of HDPE pipes or large timber or concrete kind of constructs may provide just kind of additional shelter and help animals feel more secure and potentially aid their crossing. And again, yeah, this picture on the left is from an underpass or wildlife crossing in Australia, and these kind of logs and timber were installed to help encourage koala movement throughout this underpass. And here are another couple of images just to show in North America on both passageways going under and over the highway. And here's a visual representation showing how furniture could be added to a structure known as Breezel Water River in Devon. This structure was identified to have the potential for terrestrial animals such as badgers, otters and pine martens. And it was a good opportunity for us to show how furniture, again, a really simple intervention, could be used to hopefully encourage movement under a road known as the A30. Now, there was evidence, similar to what Ben shared earlier, of this structure already being used by terrestrial animals. So again, depending on any future project-specific ambitions, perhaps at this location or others, no intervention may be considered necessary at all. Ed?
Yeah, I was only just to come in and just say it's really important with this that for a lot of species, especially smaller species, then that opening on the left-hand side there might seem really hostile. It's really open, there's no shelter, there's potential for predation going across that open space. So trying to put yourself into the eyes of the species you're looking at, and especially like an opportunity like that could provide opportunities for a range of species. So putting in a range of different furniture would really help there, because I think if you're an invertebrate or a small mammal, going across that large open space is going to be pretty sort of hostile for you, whereas perhaps deer would walk through there without really thinking about it. So just trying to think about the different species.
Also got to think there about how we, oh sorry Steve, you're talking but you're on mute, sorry. But I've just got to think, you've got to think about inspections as well of the actual structure, haven't you? So someone will need to go and check that fence is all right and be able to replace it, enough space to replace it. They'll need to check the walls of the structure, okay, maybe get stuff in there. So furniture, yeah, I think it potentially very powerful, but we just need to be strategic about where we put it. So can it all go on one side, or can it design it again, as Steve was saying, with the engineers who are going to have to look after this in order to actually get it all in the right place.
And it's really interesting, and on that, yeah, exactly, that collaboration, that idea, because somebody might go, oh, that's great, let's chuck this stuff in there, and someone else is like, we can't do that. But again, on that topic, it's interesting, speaking to perhaps some UK highways engineers about adding furniture, you know, straight away, the regulations associated with the road infrastructure network in our country, perhaps, is we don't allow this for this reason. Whereas, say, in Australia, say someone said a fire risk within the UK, but then in Australia, they've allowed it to happen. So it's kind of obviously different regulations, different reasonings, and different, you know, whatever that may be. But actually, perhaps trying to get those engineers to have a conversation to kind of be like, well, how and why did you allow that? And why didn't you, or why aren't you allowing that? And just trying to open up a dialogue to kind of see really what is possible, what are our limitations, and what are our potentially ways round things to ultimately just aid connectivity in any way we kind of can. So that's furniture. Next up, again, another common and relatively, I say this, simple intervention is kind of shelves and ledges, kind of commonly referred to as mammal shelves, but they do and have proven to be useful for a whole host of different species. These are frequently used as an enhancement that can be installed to a variety of different structure types, again, to help provide terrestrial pathways, typically for mammals and marsupials and other kind of ground moving animals. Now they come in various shapes and forms. Again, input from engineers will help to determine what may or may not be possible within your project. That could be down to the materials used, that could be used to the brackets, depending on the age and the type of the concrete of a structure. That can be really, really variable. And again, there are also guidelines for different sizes and shapes for different species, again, available within that INE handbook that I shared earlier on. Now, just to show a kind of example of collaboration, but also adaptation here, because again, we don't always get it right the first time, and adapting is important. Whether this is due to technical issues or perhaps biological changes and other considerations, admitting or identifying the need for adaptation and then acting on it is important. So the image here, the kind of shelf and the ledge might not be quite as obvious at first, but this example here shows my colleague Dean kind of in the forefront of the image in New Jersey within the USA, where he and the team at New Jersey Fish and Wildlife were kind of repurposing some of our kind of Animex fencing and placing it onto a gabion wall you can see in the back of the image. And this was to help provide a smooth surface on top of the otherwise kind of rough gabion wall. The gabion wall again was originally installed as a shelf to help aid connectivity, but was later identified to perhaps not be being as effective due to the rocky, uneven nature. So by placing this smooth kind of structure on top, covering it in a more natural substrate, they're kind of hoping that that's going to encourage more wildlife to move through. And again, that is kind of currently being monitored as I speak. Now, the next example, again, is another one from Australia, and this was kindly shared courtesy of Josie Stokes, who is the senior road ecologist for the city of the Gold Coast. Now, this ledge has been installed for koalas, and literally only just a few weeks ago, and this has been constructed from a combination of steel and recycled plastic. Now, the first round again of monitoring of this is due to come to an end soon, which will be really exciting to see, and I'm sure Josie and the team will be kind of sharing that publicly when they're able to. Now, the city of the Gold Coast developed a wildlife vehicle collision mitigation program in 2022, and this project is part of it. Now, this program identifies and ranks the top 30 hotspots for roads for wildlife, particularly vehicle strikes within this city, and then recommends site-specific mitigation measures appropriately, such as this. Josie has also shared lots of other interesting information on this project with me, but unfortunately I kind of don't have time to share that with you today. But if this is of interest, then please do get in touch and I can share more of that afterwards. And there's obviously some people there just for kind of scale. And again, to provide an example of how this enhancement type was considered and presented on a site in Devon, here we have a River Lemon culvert, which is a large concrete structure housing a river. By implementing a ledge on either side of the structure, again, we could help to provide terrestrial connectivity for animals under a road known as the A38. And you can see just on that far side, this kind of black line / ledge, it's quite zoomed out, just represents that shelf or ledge. Yes, Ben.
No, it's interesting because yeah, this is obviously we're talking about retrofitting things because there's a lot of these legacy structures around. But what do our design standards say about building new ones of those? And are we solving, because we put in new culverts, new bridges, new tunnels all the time for highway infrastructure. So one of the things we are trying to do is figuring out how we can build those better as well. So if that was double the width and allowed a bit of natural watercourse movement underneath and had a bit of riparian habitat, they might be fine. So again, there's a question for if there's transport agencies on the line that how do we build these things better, and how, if we are, because that'll have an end of life, that culvert. So if that is coming to the end of life, what can we put in there that's better? What can we put in there that's bigger? Can we turn that into a single span bridge and actually re-establish a whole ecosystem connection? So there's whole different, like once you get your head locked into this thinking and once you convince people that it's important, it sort of affects everything that we do. And if you can embed that thinking in from the very start, even if it's a little bit more money, there are pots of money for environmental improvements that you could top up existing budgets and do something a bit better. So yeah, just food for thought, I think, when we are going in and changing stuff.
Yeah, really, really good points about, when you build a new structure, almost just building in the connectivity feature within it. But then there's also an edge you may be coming in to talk about this, because it's something we've discussed quite a lot, but is on the retrofitting front, if you don't have funding or things available, but if there's funding for structure enhancements or repairs and stuff in the future, kind of if money's not available now, perhaps it's something that can be built into like rolling work programs. Yeah, Ed.
Yeah, so I was going to say very much along those lines. So yes, these sorts of things, where you're carrying out repairs or upkeep, you know, where it's practical to do so, and obviously, you know, somewhere like this has got a river crossing. So one of the other options could be to look at things like Environment Agency, who in the UK manage our water environment. That, you know, look to them. Like, it could be that removing that weir there could help fish passage, for example. But in doing that works, you could also look at other features for wildlife crossing. So there's sort of, it goes back to Steve's point earlier on about collaborations, probably opportunities to get funding to do some of these things with existing interventions, which might not actually affect the highways network that much, but it could affect the water network, it could affect the biodiversity potential. And I totally agree with Ben's point about looking at end of life and replacement. And it goes back to your Gabriel baskets that were put in. You know, there might be relatively simple, I'm not suggesting that's the best way to do it, but when we design new features, ledges could just be built into these as a matter of course. And likewise, you know, we see in buildings these days putting in things like bee bricks, or for invertebrates, or putting in nest boxes and things. They can be built into the structure of these things, and just taking that into account when you build these structures would be great. And yes, to have a clear span bridge would be amazing. To have habitat connectivity across the piece would be amazing.
Yeah, really good points. And nobody gets points for this, but there is actually already a wildlife connectivity feature, and Ed, you may have just alluded to this, within this structure already. There's kind of like a fish and eel passage kind of on this weir going down here, which again, in terms of record keeping from structure managers or constructors, was actually quite a bit of a surprise when we kind of got there to see that. And you know, there are things on the network already, and this applies, this is everywhere, not just picking on the UK here, on, you know, documentation and record keeping of structures and monitoring and things like that, as people have kind of mentioned. I see, Wendy, you've made a good point in that. I don't know if you jump onto that now. Wendy's just mentioned in the chat about seeming from the kind of Slido that there's a lot of kind of potentially preaching to the converted was quite a large area of the audience we have here. But, you know, what conversations are we having with planners and road agencies within the UK regarding connectivity? And Ben, you obviously touched on, within your role, design standards and all the work that you're kind of doing, because, you know, when the National Highways are the kind of the main road agency, particularly nationally within the UK.
Yeah, so we own the design standards which all other local authorities use. So if we can embed this sort of stuff within our design standards when we're rebuilding things, there's a potentially very powerful role for us there. And like I said in my presentation, I think our role is sort of highlighting to government that this is an issue and it needs to be properly thought about, and having delivery mechanisms to do it. So if we use the example of biodiversity net gain, which is for the international people on the call, it's a initiative program, piece of legislation, depending on what kind of project you are, where you have to put in more biodiversity than you take out when you're building something. And that's measured through units, and it's all sort of standardized. But National Highways were doing that 5-6 years before B&G was even a thing. We were sort of doing voluntary measurements and things like that. So I think there's a similar role for us to do here on connectivity, and saying this is going to be a problem. Well, it's a problem, but it's the next thing to solve. Once you've got larger areas of habitat going, the next logical solution is to connect them up. So I do think that in 5 years' time, this will be a very different conversation. So we are actively thinking about it. We're bought into doing something. It's trying to go against the inertia of a not particularly strong economy and not a lot of money flying around, and that bit about appraisal that I said before, like how do we value these things? Like if there's an operational pot of money for the A38 and we've got 5 million quid to look after the A38, whatever, how do you make sure that a little bit of that is put into this? And when you're comparing it to safety and other things that are very tangibly quantifiable, and you can put money against it and risks against it, how do we get this sort of stuff on the same level? And that's the key challenge, I think, moving forward with this, which we're actively working on at the moment.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think the UK has been doing things for years. This is not kind of brand new, and it's not right at the start, but I think we're at the start of like a new era. You know, and I think in these projects, for Network for Nature funded project, this presentation within itself, this project, and, you know, with this being recorded and shared with people in the future, part of a kind of hopeful legacy piece with IENA and design standards, you know, there is. So people like yourselves, Wendy, and everybody else on the call who may be really experienced in this, all different projects in all different parts of the world, your knowledge and sharing that with people within the UK and then, you know, other countries, as everybody does within that wider network, is really, really important and useful. So moving on to another type of enhancement, a little bit too swiftly there. In similar, in kind of a lot of ways to ledges and shelves are arboreal bridges and structures. And again, these can be added to existing assets to provide connectivity, but and they're typically used for animals that don't like to travel on the ground. Now, arboreal structures are commonly used and perhaps most popularly seen within the literature in Southern America and Australia for a whole wide range of species. And they're often in those instances kind of installed as freestanding structures. And although these are not technically, again, we're saying retrofitted enhancements, they're very relatively low cost interventions compared to larger things such as green bridges. So well worth considering. Within the UK, I've kind of been lucky enough to be involved in the designing and installing of various arboreal bridges, typically for hazel dormice, both kind of freestanding and retrofitted to underpasses. This one here, or these ones on your screen, are actually a couple that are on the M1, which is one of the major motorways within the UK. And just to kind of highlight what makes an arboreal enhancement perhaps different than standard ledges and shelves, is that they are typically semi-enclosed and provide, particularly for hazel dormice, more coverage for animals in an attempt to make them feel more safe and secure. Now, in Australia or South America, that secureness we might see more arboreal connectivity bridges that are just kind of flat rope-like configurations. But here within the UK, we've got a design that helps to seem to make animals feel more secure. And this trail camera footage here is from an early design that was monitored on the Isle of Wight, which is a kind of island just off the south coast, not too far from where I am. And here you can see that all elements of the structure are used by the target species, both kind of inside and out. And a similar design in Japan has also been shown to be used by martins and other wildlife, which again is something within the UK with pine martins we're looking to explore. And more details about that particular study can be found on the Animex website. And again, I can also share that with any of you who may be interested. I don't think this footage has been sped up. These dormice are quick. And there's a kind of red squirrel there. Not sure what it's looking for. But yeah. This full, again, there's kind of 3 minutes worth of this footage, and this is on YouTube if you wish to go and take a look afterwards. And once again, another example from Devon. This is how an arboreal bridge could be installed along the edge of a structure known as West Town Farm, going over the A30. And this is a similar concept to what's been installed on the M1 that I just showed on a couple of slides previous. Now, we're not that far away from, pardon me, opening up the floor and giving you all the opportunity to kind of have a discussion and address some of the comments and questions in the chat. But before I do so, I just want to kind of share a couple of other interesting concepts that we explored as part of this project, that they don't necessarily have a proven history of applications like the ones we've just shared, and therefore their kind of effectiveness and impact is still yet to be understood. However, I believe that these interventions are really interesting and should be considered if we're talking about looking forward and looking at the future. And they all kind of focus around this idea, which many of you will be familiar with, about kind of greening the grey, and realistically looking at kind of using natural plant materials and perhaps how we can apply this to concrete structures or unnatural surfaces on both the walls and the floors of structures, or looking at kind of reclaiming land or transforming it into kind of better areas for wildlife on linear infrastructure. Now, firstly, kind of looking at green walls. Now, most people will be familiar with this concept as it's kind of becoming a kind of growing design consideration, particularly within inner city and urban environments. So, you know, why not look to apply this to linear infrastructure? I'm very lucky and kind of just coincidentally very close to me in Southampton, just about half a mile down the road. There are kind of two really interesting examples on the road network already. Now, the first one on the kind of the column of images on the left-hand side is a purpose-built green screen that stands in front of concrete pillars on a roundabout near the busy port of Southampton, which was historically where the Titanic sailed from. This is in a heavily industrialized and urban environment. There's a kind of McDonald's and KFC, residential buildings kind of all around this roundabout, as it's kind of one of the kind of major roads off of the main motorway or highway into the city of Southampton. And although this example does not provide obvious aid for connectivity, it does obviously provide a boost for biodiversity within this kind of immediate area. Now, the second example I've observed is on the major highway or motorway, known as the M27, sorry, and that kind of represents the images on the right-hand side. And Ben, you may be able to jump in on this from a big maintenance flag, because I'm not sure, again, if this is intentional or just a happy accident, because, you know, the maintenance crews haven't caught up with this yet, and actually in time all of this vegetation will be cut back. But either way, there's large stretches of this retaining wall that have kind of been taken over by vegetation along the roadside. And again, don't know whether this is intentional and this structure has particularly been built to allow and permit that or not. But again, either way, this might not have a direct impact on helping animals across the roads, like similar interventions we've looked at, but they could help to increase biodiversity and increase habitat for wildlife. So if we had the opportunity to obviously study and understand more about these features, what maintenance requirements or design alterations, adaptations, both on old and new structures would be needed to facilitate this kind of as an idea, then it would, yeah, be really interesting to explore more on that. Ed?
Yeah, it's just that point about maybe a bit of neglect sometimes helps wildlife, you know, more than we'd imagine. And of course, it's a concept that we've seen in land management over hundreds of years, which is that rotational management allows connectivity while managing the structure. So you might allow, let's say, ivy growth up to a certain point, and then rotationally cut it, but always leaving a proportion of it attached to be able to provide connectivity of species. And we could do that with long grass, or with scrub and or shrubs and trees alongside the road network as well. So that rotational management of these sorts of structures might provide an opportunity to retain some, and you might look to have targets around how much you retain within a network and how much you need to keep on top of, or what age structure you're happy to tolerate. But these are well-worn paths, you know, and it would be good to see that sort of bedded into these approaches.
Yeah, I think John's just made a point as well, and their vegetation could also buffer noise. Again, touching on what you said earlier, Ed, about using vegetation as a natural screen, you know, is a kind of common application. And you mentioned obviously using various planting to alter behaviours of bats, birds, or any other species.
Yeah, and of course it also can soak up pollution as well. So in terms of water quality, air quality, as well as noise. Yeah, it's a whole facet of stuff, and obviously depends on how much space you've got and the tolerances of whatever structures that are there. But yeah, there should be opportunities for green, well, living vegetation to form a part of this.
Yeah, good point. And Ben's obviously just said in the chat as well there, yeah, obviously we're not touching on any other wider environmental positive impacts of anything green, but you know, that's a whole discussion that could go on as well. And Louise has kindly shared there as well about an example with vegetation in New York along major highways, again for visual and noise noise impacts. So green is good from what we're picking up on here. And again, another example from Devon of how we've illustrated how this could look on a particular structure known as the Breezel overspill on the A30, and considerations were made that, you know, perhaps this could be beneficial for bats, birds, and invertebrates. So on this same theme, if you're considering greening the walls, why not green or reclaim the floor? So in Europe, as we've mentioned, there are many old bridges and underpasses that have the potential to be converted into partially or full green bridges retrospectively. Obviously, a lot of new green bridges and wildlife crossing structures are, you know, kind of use by humans and wildlife is always a big consideration. And obviously we kind of believe, you know, that this reclamation or this greening has potential to provide kind of vast opportunities for connectivity across large geographical areas, perhaps at the fraction of a cost of, well, you know, singular big green bridges in a single area. So we don't have any examples of how this has been applied in practice yet. I am aware there is another project as part of the Network for Nature where they have looked into feasibility of greening an existing structure, but something we're kind of actively doing with National Highways is to determine the feasibility on a disused bridge over what is kind of a really large 8-lane motorway known as the M27. And following the technical review of what we're proposing, we kind of hope to be able to kind of deploy and monitor a system we're kind of calling the Habitat Highway in years to come. And you can find out more about what we've been doing of monitoring this bridge and kind of details of that via that QR code on your screen. And then just to kind of elaborate, here are kind of a few visualizations of how we're proposing to perhaps temporarily reclaim a small strip of this larger bridge, just to give you some perspective. And you can see that, you know, each end there are kind of areas and modules that will connect seamlessly with adjacent habitats. And then the plan for this intervention is to house kind of soil and self-water irrigation systems to kind of support the growth of natural or native hedgerow and meadow flowers and grass types. And again, here's an example of how we've illustrated this kind of reclamation idea on the Meldon Quarry Access Bridge, again on the A30. You can see by this visualization, the kind of habitat highway reclamation intervention could theoretically be placed over the concrete path or sidewalk. And again, this was a considered intervention that could be beneficial perhaps for a wide range of species, but again, as a kind of untested idea, research and evidence of this would need to be explored, not just to mention, you know, engineering, safety, maintenance requirements in order for this to be considered safe and appropriate in any given location. Ed?
Yeah, it's just coming on an example that we've had from the project around invertebrates for this. So we tend to defer to things like hedges or species-rich grassland as the sort of two main habitats we look at. But we've got a species called narrow-headed ant, which lives pretty much its only UK site is right adjacent to one of these roads that we're talking about. And it's prevented from crossing over, obviously, by the road. But it's reliant on heathland and creating some simple sort of sandbox type heathland vegetation across the highway could provide opportunities for a species which is absolutely pinned into a single site in the whole of the UK to be able to expand out. Now, even if it didn't take that opportunity, so I think we've got to expect that nature doesn't always go where you want it to go. Just the fact that we'd have created that heathland habitat across a bridge, potentially provide opportunities for other heathland species to move across, would be a win in its own right. And then obviously, if narrow-headed ant did move across, you've just, you know, given it a second site to be active on. So I think we should always look at multiple different habitat types. And while we might use a single species as the justification for it, that should give opportunities for lots of related species or species that use similar habitats to benefit from it.
Yeah, great points, especially the narrow-headed ant. It's such a kind of unique species. So yeah, again, just to kind of reiterate that all of the illustrations and interventions that we've been showing in this kind of Devon context are purely just to give you an idea, and they're not currently being planned or proposed to be installed or initiated by National Highways. And that's it. Before we kind of open up into kind of some questions and discussion with actually what quite limited time we have left, just want to do a quick recap. So we've explored how roads and linear infrastructure impact wildlife. We've then looked at where opportunities for connectivity may be and perhaps how to identify them. We then explored what potential enhancements are and what might be appropriate for different situations and species. We then touched on how do we actually get enhancements or interventions implemented, and that was through discussing collaborations and the need to be persistent and patient. We then explored and shared some existing real-world examples of different interventions in different places and showed how they've been kind of identified as options and illustrated within our Creating Species Highways project within Devon. So yeah, we have some time for questions, comments, discussion, anything anybody wants to kind of ask or share while we have the time would be very, very welcome. I'm just going to kind of scroll through the chat. I saw a few. The chat was quite organically kind of responding to itself as we went. We've got Paul. Yeah, I'll just enable your audio. Hi, Paul. You should be able to talk now.
Good afternoon, Steve.
Hi, Paul.
Thank you so much for the presentation, and thank you for all the hard work you're doing. And it has been an eye-opening when you said in the UK there are, we lacking these crossings and improvement and things like that, and these interventions. It's not only UK. It looks like a lot of countries in the world and around the world are lacking. And so now you open people's eyes and you educating people. And I get opportunity to live in America. Some areas, they have not even touched with this intervention. Some areas are working on it. And so stuff like this will help us to mitigate and to also learn from one another. Also, thank you for saying that we have to learn from one another, giving examples from Australia to Devon and other places. So it is great that you did this, and we support you. And anytime you put stuff together, let us know. And my last comment is, sometimes you have this noble idea and there will be opposition, whether you like it or not. And so you have to build consensus. Elected officials, colleges, high schools, elementary schools, get the public involved. I remember during the Slido comment, somebody put citizen science. Use them and let them also help and let them know what you're doing and the end result of it. Thank you so much.
No, pleasure. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, and just on your point again, the collaboration, the information sharing, the conversations, you know, what we're doing here. I've just kind of put on, you kind of preempted a slide I was going to close on in a minute, but you know, for those of you who kind of aren't aware, many of you will be, but there are so many great organizations and networks about linear, not just transport, you know, linear infrastructure in general. I mentioned Diana being one of those. We got Ackley, who Wendy contributed quite a lot of the conversations. It's part of the same with the Global Congress. We have ICOET, the California Connectivity Conference is the bottom left one, which is due to be happening this year, and we have Northeast and US and ANET as well. Ed.
Yeah, I was just going to come back on Paul's excellent comments. I thought they're really great to hear. So I think engaging people is going to be really valuable in this. I think a lot of people look at roadkill on a major road and just sort of glance at it as something that they see and don't really think about. And I think explaining what the sort of population level impacts are and engaging the communities that live around roads is really important. The point around citizen science, community science is really important as well. So those people have the time, they live right on site often. While they can't necessarily always access the highway or safely, they can be watchers and maybe you can engage them with automated monitoring and the likes as well, and they can certainly work either side of it. So I think we're seeing citizen science become a more and more important part of how we monitor the landscape. We're using it a lot in the wider landscape. Yeah, it'd be great to see it embedded in this as well.
Yeah, really good point. Again, it's data is key, isn't it? And particularly this, and people power. Sometimes kind of citizen scientists can be kind of discarded as, oh, not scientists, data doesn't count. But I think that's really not fair and not true. There's so many great citizen science initiatives and projects kind of all across the world that really helps to gain, again, quite primarily and predominantly it is roadkill data, but that's also an interesting reflection. And I don't think Sarah's on the call today, but Sarah Perkins from the Road Lab and Cardiff University in the UK. I remember one of the first times I met her and the team, they spoke about, they used to do a kind of public engagement exercise at exhibitions where they would have kind of two tokens in a box and say, have you seen these British wildlife and have you seen them alive or dead on the road? And actually you shouldn't really be coming into that much wildlife, particularly if they're nocturnal animals in your day-to-day life. So not really expected to see a lot of badgers or perhaps foxes, but you actually find out a lot of people have seen these dead on the side of the road. So although it's quite morbid and it's quite sad, everybody seems to have a direct example or a connection with the impact of transport infrastructure and wildlife. If you contrast that to paper, plastic straws and turtles, like how many people have actually seen a plastic straw in a turtle in real life? But we can still, there's a public compassion and reaction to that, that initiates a change. So the more and more we make transport infrastructure and it's
get it right,
aware of, then there's something we could kind of be doing more of and making this more kind of mainstream news, and hopefully using that to kind of implement other changes. So yeah, thanks, Paul. Is there, I'm just again going to go through the chat, and again, if anybody else wants, just like Paul, to make any contributions or questions, please just raise your hand. Terry, really
Steve,
good point there. Sorry, Ed, go on.
Oh, sorry. No, I was only going to make the point again that I think when we're looking at some of the examples from around the world are excellent examples, and they've been done for specific species. Your koala examples in Australia and the likes. If we take those examples and think, how could you make that appropriate for more species, then it gives a bigger cost benefit. So for every one of those examples, it's like your bridge, arboreal bridge, is supporting multiple species. How can we help those same interventions help more species? So putting in a little bit of a refuge within an arboreal bridge suddenly means that smaller mammals can cross it. Same could happen on that koala bridge. It could be something underneath the koala bridge or on top of it. There are probably multiple places where if you just think more than the species you have to look at, then with very little cost, we can probably make this work for far more wildlife.
Yeah, really good points. And to touch on what Terry's put in the chat there, those books, particularly the Ben Goldfarb book Crossings, which came out last year, there was quite a lot of press around that. And I do believe Ben is actually giving one of the keynote speeches at ICOET this year, this kind of May time in Colorado, which is the International Conference on Ecology and Transportation. So yeah, please check out those books. I'm skipping through. Sorry, my mouse is glitching. I did see Kerry Gunson shared earlier about, I think it was linking to when we were talking about biologists and engineers in that collaboration. Obviously, if you're able to within biology and transport ecology within the industry, obviously a subsector of biologists. You know, if you're able and have there's so many transport focused and experienced ecologists and biologists out there, please do, you know, tap into that expertise and knowledge. A lot of professionals from across the world that I particularly encountered, you know, if you don't have somebody or an experience of something near you, then there is, again, as part of this kind of network of some of these organizations here, it's very easy to find people, and people are within this community are particularly really willing to share and help in any capacity they can. And again, Ben's just shared a kind of video in there. I think this might be a kind of nice little thing to end on.
Yeah, if you mute that, Steve, I can sort of talk about what's going on there. If that's useful and of interest.
Yeah, I'll wind it back. Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so this is one of our 3 green bridges that are in construction at the moment. So this is just outside of London in Surrey, doing a scheme there to upgrade a junction of the A3 and the M25, one of the busiest junctions in the whole country, one of the most but the A3 has cut a European protected site, SSI, local nature reserve, all of the above, into for about 50 years. So when I was talking about taking those opportunities when you're there to do something, this is an opportunity where we're doing a major project, but we're also defragmenting those 2 sites, as we have done from while we're there, and while we've got diggers there, and while we've got kit there, and that should be open the end of this year. And yeah, it's been designed specifically for rare heathland species, so I'm focusing on sand lizards and silver-studded blues, actually. So should be quite an interesting one, and should be a case study and lots of lessons learned for national highways in learning how to do these things, as they are quite rare. So we are doing something. I think that's important to end on. I think that we've talked about lots of hypotheticals, but there is stuff happening, and there is momentum building for change. So it's just making sure that change is recognised and valued, and I think we'll get a lot more projects out the back of it.
Yeah, exactly. And you're a massive part of that within our country, Ben, and the work that you're doing is fantastic, and the wider team as well. And I think, yeah, really good point to end on. And I'm actually just going to throw it out there. I think that would be a great field trip to take a trip there.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
The INE conference, you know, in kind of summer next year. So again, big plug for this. Keep your eyes peeled for more info on that in the weeks and months to come. And that's it. We'll wrap it up there. So again, thanks again for everyone. Massive thanks again for Ed and Ben for working with us, or for us having the opportunity to work with you on this, should I say. If you can, please donate to Devon Wildlife Trust. And then there's obviously links to Network for Nature. This, as I mentioned, has been recorded, so we will circulate this afterwards. We've had, you know, up to kind of 90 people on the call. There was nearly 200 who signed up. So obviously some members of people who couldn't join us today, and hopefully we'll be able to pick up this and watch that afterwards. So yeah, thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks all.